most interesting thing in impact, a really interesting conversation I overheard between 3 executive directors of charities recently. Their concern? What happened to trust-based philanthropy? It's only been a handful of weeks into 2024, but I also find myself asking this very question. And listen, we don't have an annual trust-based philanthropy index in Canada, and perhaps there should be. But in the absence of such an index, the question at hand for me is trust and long-term relationships at the center of your funding model. Do you trust your grantees and partners to seek solutions, lead, manage, learn, and allocate capital? Are you carving out time to learn from your partners? What is your accountability to the grantee? Trust-based philanthropy has been around for centuries in many communities, but it first took root in North American institutions in the early 2000s, when some philanthropic leaders began questioning whether traditional grant-making practices produced skewed results due to power imbalances, warped incentives, and burdensome requirements. There's been lots and lots written about trust-based philanthropy, but at its core, it's a relational approach that prioritizes trust, transparency, learning, and collaboration between funders and grantees. It's grounded in the belief that the recipients of funding are the best folks equipped to identify, address, and steer the funds for their projects, programs, and services. Trust-based philanthropy saw a short-lived spike during the COVID pandemic, pun intended, when grantmakers and funders around the world lifted restrictions on how and where money could be spent and lifted restrictions on reporting. Now, the reason this was such a breath of fresh air was because it started like there was something here. Because conventional funding is rooted in inequity and power imbalances. There were onerous application and reporting requirements, short-term volatile funding, restrictions imposed on grantees and how to spend the money, making people account for pencils and pens that they'll use. Frankly, it's ridiculous. And that's even been my experience recently. So, what happened to trust-based philanthropy? What happened to unrestricted grants, multi-year grants by default, simplified reporting requirements and applications, transparency in the decision-making process? What about funder accountability, engaging in active listening to grantees? What about engaging in mutual learning? Because here's the nuance. While folks like Mackenzie Scott's historic decision to give away billions in unrestricted grants has been commendable, unrestricted funding alone does not equate to trust-based philanthropy. You can't just do unrestricted funding and say, okay, we're good, we feel good about it, and that's all there is to it. In Canada, funders are on different points of the journey when it comes to genuine trust-based relationships. And Future of Good has covered a number of these organizations that authentically invest in mutual learning and collaboration, including the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, the Right Relations Collaborative, and a number of others. But back to my experiences and my eavesdropping. It also feels like the ecosystem is stagnating and slipping backwards a bit. Trust-based philanthropy starts with recognizing that we operate in an inequitable sector and society that is rooted in white-dominant norms and assumptions. Institutional philanthropy's standards of trustworthiness are often defined by multi-year financial data, quantifiable impact, notable board members, academic achievement. These are all inherently top-down and exclusionary. In 2024, I'm wishing for serious discussions in leadership teams of grant makers to invite their grantees to assess if they genuinely practice trust-based relationships. There's a challenge for you. In 2024, I'd like to see an authentic approach to relationship building, mutual learning, transparency, accountability, and trust between funders and social purpose organizations. That's the most interesting thing in impact. See you around.